Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to the 6th week of class. This is our first video called Designing an Audio Podcast, and this is part of our graduate course, Principles of Interface Design. In this video, we're going to focus on audio and how to create an audio podcast. Our second video of this series, we're going to take a look at designing Active Inspire flip charts for use with the Promethean board. Now that's going to be a longer video. That's about an hour-long video, and I purposely did that because all semester long I've been creating videos that are shorter in length, 20 to 30 minutes approximately, and this one I purposely did a little bit longer so you could get the feel for a longer presentation. And then at the end of this week's class, our application will be your choice of either designing an audio podcast or designing a flip chart through Active Inspire to use on the Promethean board. We live in a world of visual, a lot of video we see. So one of the things we have to take a look at in this week's class is what could a teacher and students do with audio? So what could you possibly do? Well, the nice thing is that audio is, it's very portable. Students can take audio with them anywhere they go because they don't have to look at anything. They can simply have earbuds and just listen along while they're in transportation or walking or at home, in school. So it's very highly portable. So what could you possibly do with this audio? As a teacher, you could provide a summary or a review or another look at the items, the content that was learned. You could just do logistical things, simple things like speak the homework or describe the activities that are due as a reminder to students. So that could be a very short audio portion or podcast. You could provide a further explanation of concepts that might be difficult, where students need to maybe hear it a second time or hear it in a little different way. You could record an interview with someone, and that could provide another voice other than yours in the classroom. It could be a different perspective on a topic other than just yours and the textbooks. You could add to the diversity of learning resources by doing this because it's just another different kind of thing that you can add. For our students for whom English is not their first language, they can listen and hear the pronunciation, and also if they're English learners, they might benefit just by listening back to the content, and they could slow it down on their device. They could speed it up if they want to, and of course listen back several times. You could do another just logistical thing. You could provide audio feedback while you're reading a paper or an assignment, so it can be more explanatory than just written comments, maybe on a rubric. Another totally different idea is to have your students generate a podcast, and they can teach the content back to you. So there are a plethora of uses for audio. We described that audio is very portable. So consider who is going to be listening or who could listen, and then select appropriate content for that audience or that sub-audience. For example, it could be ideal for audio learners, or for those who are taking a long bus ride and they have a lot of time to listen, not necessarily to read. It could be distracting, but to listen, it could be ideal for them. Listening may be more effective than text for readers who are a little weaker in the reading area. You could present verbal information as an additional learning channel along with some visual. Rather than the student just reading about it, they can hear as they look at that particular that image or a chart or some other type of visual information. This is ideal. It's an ideal medium for acquiring small chunks of verbal information. You would probably not serve your students well if you were giving an hour-long audio podcast with tons of information, because a lot of that would get lost, but ideal for small chunks of information. And again, it's a great medium if you're looking to a little more casually, a little more conversationally provide explanations of something for students. And many times that would be something that you're assessing of their work. Let's begin our consideration of design of an audio podcast by considering the parts of an audio podcast. First, we have a solid introduction. Introduce yourself and the aims and the objectives of the podcast. As already mentioned, consider the fact that there's no visual with your audio podcast. So be very explicit as you introduce things, as you describe how you're going to present the content in the podcast. So start off with a good introduction, then the content is your main message, and then don't forget to conclude, once again, because there's no video, there's no visual support for the learners. So conclude by presenting a summary of the content, and then you can also describe if there's an activity or some action the student needs to take at the end. But summarize and make it clear that you're concluding. And again, for cognitive purposes, make sure that you present a summary of what has happened. Now, optionally, for a more professional sounding audio podcast, you may want to add an intro and possibly an outro. An intro would consist of fading in with some brief music, and then introduce yourself, or if you have a series, or if this is going to be, you're going to have several podcasts for your class, then that would be like your series. Then you could introduce that, kind of like on a TV show when they have a standard opening. And then also optionally, you could use an outro, which would be, once again, bringing in that theme music, and then fade out, and maybe you saying something like, thanks for your attention, and look forward to seeing you at the next podcast, or something to that extent, something to that nature. So the main pieces here: introduction, content, and conclusion. Be very specific and explicit. Make sure that you're providing structural information and clues and cues in addition to the content, and then optionally intro, outro. For your students to buy into your podcast, one of the most important design elements is your personality. Be natural, be yourself. So treat the podcast like it's you talking to a student, and you're excited about the content. You just want to share the content, so you describe it as if you were just talking or conferencing with an individual student. Don't try to put on some kind of a fake voice or be like a radio personality or try to be someone that you're not. Be real, be enthusiastic, but be you. Be aware of the length of time of your podcast. In general, unless you have a good reason for making it longer, keep it relatively short. Determine how much length is really needed, and keep in mind, as opposed to in-person, face-to-face teaching, you don't have to repeat the content over and over again, because the students have the opportunity to run it back and hear it a second time or a third time. So keep it short and avoid the repetition of the content as you would in real life. Because an audio podcast has no visual element with it, it's very important for you to be very organized and for you to make that organization, that structure of the podcast, to make it very apparent to the learners. Describe the content in the outline when you introduce the podcast. Remind the learners as you're speaking and presenting your content, when you're transitioning, make sure that you're reminding, like if you're going to cover 3 steps of something, then remind them, now this is step 2 of 3, and now we will proceed on to the third and final step. So make it very overt. Don't forget to provide a solid summary and a review to make up for the lack of the visual piece. If you're going to have a follow-up podcast, describe how this particular podcast episode will transition. In other words, how this unit fits into the grand scheme of your podcasts. To create a more professional sounding podcast, optionally, you might want to consider adding what's called an outro and an intro. The benefits of a positive intro and outro is that it could allow you to create a branding, if you will, to create like as on TV shows, like sitcoms, for example. And every week you look for that particular branding. You look for the same elements to kind of lead you into that show. It also serves to gain attention, and it also, again, adds to the validity because it's more professional sounding. So a lot of benefits to adding these brief pieces, definitely at the beginning and possibly one at the end. The process involves adding a bit of brief music at the beginning and again possibly at the end of the podcast, and then speak a standard introduction over the music. And if you make this as a standard beginning and possibly a standard ending, then you can copy and paste this material and use it again and again in your whole series of podcasts. What kind of apps can you download to support your creation of podcasts? Well, my favorite recording app, which is for free, it's an open source app. It's called Audacity. And this is a good, standard, well-respected, very stable app that has been used by many people for a number of years. So I highly recommend using this app to do some recording. There are a number of other apps available, but definitely this one I recommend. How can you find free music to support intros and outros? Well, here's one site that I like called Jamendo, and Jamendo allows you to download free music, and a lot of it is something that you really could use as theme music, something that's more nondescript, so it's not something with words and things of this nature that will really call attention to itself. It'll sit like nestled gently in the background, again, to create a good theme for your podcast. You can also search online for free or royalty-free music clips. If you go to download Audacity, which version, which link do you select? Well, on the site that allows you to download, if you're a Windows user, then select the Audacity Windows installer, and that will give you the full program. If you're a Mac user, then of course select that appropriate link at this site as well. Before we go in and demo the Audacity app, let's get a brief understanding of the interface. First, in the upper left-hand corner of the app, we find the recording and the playback tools, and they should be intuitive. It's the play button and the record button and the pause button and so on. Next to these playback and recording tools, we see selection tools, and these will allow you to select and also time shift various elements of your recording, your different sounds. And we'll take a look at that as we demo how this works. Next is the decibel meter. Two important things with the decibel meter. Number one, make sure that there's enough sound coming out so that if it's very low and it appears that there's hardly any sound being recorded, then we need to turn up or turn down the audio input and output levels. In other words, if your microphone cannot be heard, turn it up. The second most important thing is with the decibel meter, make sure that it's not hitting the top of the range where it goes into the red zone. If it does, it will tend to distort. So once again, go to the audio input and output levels and adjust that microphone accordingly. And then on the main part of the screen, the majority will be waveforms. In other words, these are your recordings. These are different sounds that you will record, and you'll see the waveform appear in front of you. And you're going to find that we can use these and manipulate these just like we would text within a word processor. And finally, by each track that's recorded, so a track is one recording, you'll find tools to affect the sound in that track. So for example, there's an individual volume for that track. This is where you can adjust up or down when you're balancing the different tracks. Is it too loud? Is it too soft? You'll also find other tools there like mute and solo, and we will cover that when we demo this. And also in the upper left-hand corner of each track is an X to delete that track if you need to. Here's a close-up capture of some of the most important tools in Audacity. The playback and recording controls are critical. We use those constantly. And then the selection tool, which looks like an I-beam, an insertion beam, allows you to select various audio data and then work with it, including you can select it, highlight it, and then hit the delete key to remove it. And also the time shift tool is another really critical tool, because that will allow you to move the recording data from the left to the right. You can shift it in time. The volume controls that we mentioned earlier are critical to properly using Audacity. And here's a close-up capture of those tools. On the bottom, you can see the input level. So that would be the way to adjust the microphone up or down. And then the output level. So however you've recorded it, you could tone it down a little bit or raise it up a little bit. And you can see just how loud it will be, besides actually hearing it, by looking at the decibel meter, and that shows the output level. And then again, if it starts to hit in a red line, if it's in a red zone where it's getting too loud, it will tend to distort. To record with Audacity, number one step is make sure that the microphone and speakers, that everything is working and that the sound volumes are adjusted appropriately. So test it and make sure that it's working right before you commit to recording an entire presentation. Our second step is hit the record button, and then you can pause it if you need to. And if you pause, there'll be no noticeable or audible break in any way. When you're done recording, hit the stop button. So to finish, press stop, and then you're done. So the recording is actually very straightforward and really easy to do. Now, how do you create an intro or possibly an outro? Well, we have to start by importing a music file. So you can go to a site like Jamendo or to a similar site and go to the File menu in Audacity and say Import, and then select Audio. So doing that will insert it directly in as a track in your file. Now you may want to fade it in, or you may want to just fade it out. In order to do that, start by using the selection tool, highlight a part of the music, for example, toward the end of the song, and then select Effects and Fade Out. And that will make for a nice transition between the music and the next part of your podcast, so it's not an abrupt break off of the music. Again, if you select a portion of the music, the part you select, that's before you select fade in or fade out, that will affect how long does that fade in or fade out take place. And then create another track where you can do your voiceover. So it'll be a separate track. And then use the time shift tool as needed to properly line up those elements. And then we finish by mixing them. In other words, we adjust the individual track volumes as needed to ensure that your music is not too loud and to ensure that your voice can be heard over the background of music. This will become more clear as we see a demonstration of use of this app. Here we are looking at the main Audacity screen. So let's take a look at how we could record a podcast in this great app. First of all, I'm going to start by creating an intro. I'm going to do that by adding some music, and then I'm also going to put my voice in there. And then I'll proceed to add an audio track, which will be the content of the podcast. So I'm going to say File, Import. I'm going to start with an audio. Now in this case, I created this song because I am a musician. But I also just as easily could have gone online, so this is an MP3 file, and I could have looked for a musical file, something that's a background song, something that's suitable for podcast, just nondescript music. And I'll play a little bit of this for you. Notice the standard buttons up here. I'm going to press play. That's a little loud, so I'm going to turn that down a little bit. It's also going to be a little bit long. So in addition to play, stop, and record, we also have the rewind button, skip to home. And that's going to be a very important button to use, because you always want to make sure that you're recording from the beginning if that's indeed where you want to record from. So always be aware of where this recording head is. If I hit the skip to the beginning, it'll always take me right back to the home here. Notice that I've got two different tracks here, and they seem to be duplicates. As we look at the waveforms drawn onto those tracks, realize that that's because this is a stereo song. A lot of music is recorded in stereo, and that's the equivalent of having two microphones both recording simultaneously. What the stereo does is create that extra effect, that extra dimension, and you can have little different sound in coming through each of the speakers, each of the microphones as they're recorded. So realize a lot of music is recorded this way, and that's why these two tracks will be used together here. The opposite of stereo is mono, or the full word is monaural. So when we're recording for our voice, there's probably no need to add that extra depth. And also, most computers and computerized devices only have one microphone, so no sense to even attempt to record in stereo, because that would require two mics. Now, here I have my volume. Also, I can actually pan this. Since it's stereo, I could go left and right, and I could experiment with that if I wanted to. Also notice there's a solo and a mute button. If I say mute, this is temporarily disabled and you won't hear this play. If I've got several tracks here, if I press solo, it means only this track will play, and the other tracks will automatically be muted temporarily. At this point, I'm going to go out and get my music. So I'm going to press mute. I'm sorry, I already have my music in. I'm going to record my sound. So let me go to tracks. I'm going to say add a new track. Again, for my voice, that's going to be mono. So here it is. Now what I'm going to do is click into this track to make it active. But one other thing we want to do is up here, Audacity says, are you in the stereo, one of the stereo channels, or are you in the mono channels? So if I were accidentally in the stereo and I clicked into this mono track, it would just go back, and by default it would be adding on to this stereo track. So just a little hint, make sure if you're recording your voice and it's mono, select mono up here, and then click into this track to make it active. I'm going to do this right from the beginning, and so I press my rewind or skip to home, and now I'm going to press the record button. So here I go. Hi, this is Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to this podcast. So there it is. Now here's the really interesting thing. Audacity and apps like it allow you to play with sounds just like they were words in a word processor. So, for example, I was up here with this selection tool. Now I'm going to come over here to the time shift tool. So I select that 2 arrow. Look at this. I can now move, and I could do this with any track that I wanted to. So I think what I want to do is I'm going to shift this down a little bit. I'm going to go up here and unmute this, and let's go right back to the beginning, and let's hear what this sounds like.
Hi, this is Dr. Steve.
I think about there is where I want to have my voice come in. So I'll have my voice come in about there. My voice is going to end right over here where I'm pointing. So I'm going to go up to the selection tool, which again, while I'm here, I could move these around too. Isn't that cool how we can do that? But I'm going to leave that right there. I'm going to grab this selection tool and let me take, say from about here, I'm going to select to about here, and I'm going to say, I want a special effect. I want to fade the music out so it doesn't just stop. And then I'm going to take from this point, I get my pointer there. I want to take it from, oops, I want to get my pointer right where it stops. So right from there, and take it out to the end of the clip. And I'm simply going to hit the delete key. And let's hear what that sounds like now. It's a good start to the music.
Hi, this is Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to this podcast.
Notice I'm going to turn the music volume down a little bit because I'm not hearing my voice as well. Let me try it one more time.
Hi, this is Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to this podcast.
Now the music fades out, and now I want to add another track now that I have my intro together. So let me go to tracks, let me add a new mono track. I'm going to click here, and at this point I'm going to click right where this music and the whole intro stopped. I'm checking to make sure it says mono recording. Yes, it does. Now I'm ready to start the podcast. So let me just begin it here. So on today's podcast, we're going to be discussing the Audacity app and looking at how to actually create a podcast. I'm going to stop it. Let me do one more piece here. As you can see that this will now, this third track will just pick up from where the other ones left off. Let's say that I had an error in here. So let me play with this track that I just created for a moment. Let's just listen to it for a moment.
So on today's podcast, we're going to be discussing the Audacity app.
Okay, right there, I'm going to be discussing the Audacity app, but I really don't want to have this other material here. So I can just highlight it, the selection tool, and hit the delete key. If I wanted to, I could do more than one take, because I could look back here and say, well, maybe I made some other error. So it's just like word processing.
On today's podcast, we're going to be discussing
the, I'm going to go right in that area, and let me take that out of there. I'm going to delete that, and I could now pick up recording there, because I'm not going to be discussing the Audacity app. The Power Free Music Editor app. I'll take that back to here, and let's hear what it sounds like.
We're going to be discussing the Power Free Music Editor.
So, how great is that? Even if you make an error in the middle, let's say you cough or sneeze, or you have a pause or a if you have any errors like that, you can actually select them and take them out. Like, for example, this could be a little cough or something, or this could be a pause. And actually here I do have a little pause. So I can take more of that pause out by hitting the delete key. And now the pause just won't be there, and I'll just verify it.
We could be discussing the power-free.
And nobody knows that you did that. When you've completed your work, when you say save, file save from the Audacity menus, realize that you'll be saving in their native format, their proprietary format. Now that's important because you want to save the source file in case you want to make some changes to it. But when you're completely finished and you're ready to share that with your class, then you need to export this file, because not every one of your students is going to own the Audacity app. So what we want to do is export it to a popular format, such as an MP3. All students can play an MP3 on all of their devices. You could also export it as a WAV file. So to do that, we say File and Export from the menus, and that will be the file that you'll share with people, and it will be universally accessible by anyone with a device. So here, to wrap up, let me just demo very quickly the saving process. So first, I'm going to go up and say File, Save the Project. When I say Save Project, that will now save it in a format that is proprietary just to Audacity. The nice thing is it's your source file, so if you need to go back in and change something, you'll still have access to do that. But you cannot share that file with all of your students, because many people will not actually own this app. So in that case, we'll go down to, when we've saved it in the native format, let's go to Export and export as an MP3. Now you'll notice this, now here I can create the file name that I want to use, and it's an MP3 file. This will be the type of file that you can share with all of your students, and it will be accessible on any of their devices. So in summary, in this video, we considered the mechanics of using Audacity to record a podcast, and we also considered some design guidelines that you can incorporate into a podcast as you record it for your classes. And one of the chief guidelines is, remember to be very explicit with how you organized your content. Keep in mind that an audio podcast is a non-visual medium, so we have to make up for the lack of the visual aspect of the presentation. I hope you'll find that creating an audio podcast is an easy type of activity for a teacher to do, and that it can be of good support to your students who are taking your classes.